hope you can see me and hear me. Sadly, I can't see you, but basically, this particular presentation, if you can call it that, is really to tell you a little bit about uh, this book called Inventors, which I've written about a number of inventors who have tried to change the world. I think basically the thing about inventors is that they, on the whole, don't necessarily want to become famous. I know that we we tend to think about being famous too often, and we also think that we want to be rich. And most of the inventors I've written about in this book haven't become particularly famous, and certainly many of them aren't rich, and many of them one wouldn't have heard of. And the other thing is that they all have one thing in common, which is they've all failed. Basically, in order to invent something, you have to fail. And I'll talk about failure in due course because I think the biggest lesson I can suggest is that in order to succeed, you have to fail. And I think in my life, I've failed so often as a sort of inventor scientist. In order to get something to work, you have to do it, find out that it's gone wrong, work out how it can go right. And some inventions take many, many years to get going. Some of the projects I've been working in science have taken me more than 30 years to get to a project. The research I'm doing at the moment, I first thought of 33 years ago, and we're just now beginning to discover things which might make this very, very different and understand much more about how we can treat people with a particular medical condition. So that's the story about me. Um, and I think the other thing I want to say is that in addition to learning from failure, one of the ways of really being successful is not actually just competing. So many of these inventors didn't compete with other people. Of course, many of them were in a race to get a patent, that is, to make sure that they had the first name on that particular invention. But most people have done stuff by really working with other people, building what other people know, talking to other people, reading their books, reading their papers, understanding them and getting on. And I think that one of the biggest messages in life, and I've seen this, I think, I don't know about me, but certainly for my family and my friends and most of the people I know who are successful, the most successful people have been brilliant at collaboration. They've cooperated, they've worked together, they've tried to be good natured, they've tried to be polite, they've tried to get inside the other person's skin and understand what's making them anxious. And certainly in my own scientific team, and I had a large scientific team until I started really winding down and retiring a bit from doing active work with patients and just doing work on in a laboratory, which doesn't require such a big team. I think we certainly have always parted together, we go skiing together, we do things together, we go out and have meals together, and that's been as important as any of the experiments and any of the inventions that we've done collectively as a team. So, a third thing I want to say about inventing is that you don't have to be a white male. For example, in this book, we've got hundreds of people, well, I say hundreds of people, lots and lots of people who come from all different sorts of countries, from China, from India, from Africa, and they are native to those countries, and they've done things which are quite amazing to help other people. And many of them are boys, and many of them are girls. And I think it's very important for you girls to understand that you can absolutely compete with any boy at your age or anybody that you think is clever. Don't think that you aren't clever too. Don't think that you aren't capable of doing something. Don't be less confident because you've been kind of persuaded to believe that you shouldn't really be trying to compete with people who are better than you are. And I think that's a really important thing. Now, what I'm looking for are some questions. I don't know. Oh, we've got quite a lot coming up. So, um, I don't know. We've got chats, but I don't see any questions on the how I get your questions. How do I do that? Can somebody help me? Because I've got chats. Um, ah, no, I don't understand. I don't understand how I get these questions. Um, Maybe somebody could get on the phone and talk to me about that. Can anybody help me? No. All right, okay, so let's just carry on continuing. So in this book, we've got um, this, well, let's just have a look. I'll tell you, one of the things that I've done in my life is to try and help people who can't have children. You know, the thing that we value most as humans in our entire life, actually, for nearly all of us, is having our own family, the family which we love and develop and bring up. And our main contribution, I think, is to continue the human species and to help people have children and also make sure the children are healthy. So, two of my heroes in this book, one is a Chinese man called Ming Chang, and the other one is a lady called Anne McLaren. There we are, Anne McLaren. Now, let me just talk about them because they're really interesting people. Nobody remembers that the test tube baby treatment was invented by Ming Chang. They always think of the first baby as Louise Brown some 40 years ago, but actually the real science was done well before her birth by this really unknown Chinaman. He came from China, not speaking hardly a word of English when he was a teenager, and he settled in Edinburgh, in that very cold city. He hated the weather there because it was so cold and wet. And finally, he went to Cambridge. He managed to show people that he was fairly bright, and he went to Cambridge. And he didn't do his university degree there. He already had some training already, but he did do a doctorate. He did a PhD, and in his PhD, he did a whole number of experiments showing how the sperm work and how the sperm fertilize an egg, and he showed also how how different animals like mice and rabbits, rats, hamsters, guinea pigs, a whole lot of small mammals, how each of those animals could be helped to get pregnant with a special technique that he invented. So what he did was he fertilized the eggs of mice, putting the sperm and the egg together, having made sure that the sperm were chemically treated so they would fertilize the egg with a special chemical we all carry in our bodies, us as well as mice. And then he got the eggs to fertilize, and he put the fertilized eggs back into the womb, into the uterus of the rodents, of the mice, and he got the world's first test tube babies, but they were mouse babies, they weren't human babies. And then he did the same thing in a lot of other furry animals, rabbits, for example, which are very difficult to do, but he did that as well, and he did it in hamsters. And eventually he ended up doing IVF, in vitro fertilization, on monkeys, which of course are very close to the human. Now, the other person is Anne McLaren, a female scientist who's my personal kind of heroine, because Anne McLaren was this wonderful individual who was always sharing the knowledge she had with other people. And when I couldn't get human in vitro fertilization to work, and I found that I couldn't manage to get the sperm that I'd collected from different men to try and fertilize their wife's eggs, I went to Anne McLaren, and I was almost in tears actually when it didn't work. I'd been failing repeatedly. And I went to Anne, and she looked at me and she said, well, of course, I've been doing it in mice for a long time, but sometimes it doesn't work in mice. And then she said, you know, sometimes it doesn't work. And I think, she said, it's something to do with the sunspots. And I thought, what does she mean by that? The point was, of course, she didn't know how the sunspots worked really either. And she had no idea why sometimes her experiments failed and sometimes they were successful. But she went on to be a great success and really was one of the great women in science in my field, probably one of the greatest women ever in science. So that was her. And then if we move on, we've got this wonderful woman scientist here, Tu Yu. She's a Chinese lady, and her story is absolutely astonishing. She was able to realize that we needed to improve the treatment of malaria. It's a very serious disease in China, or at least it was, and it's still a very serious disease in parts of Africa. Millions of people each year die of this parasite, which is given to them as a result of a mosquito bite. The mosquito sucks the blood from a person, and replaces with that droplet of blood a tiny little fluid that they've produced, inside of which is this parasite. It gets into the bloodstream of humans or animals like cattle, and it causes malaria. And malaria causes, and has caused over many centuries, vast numbers of human deaths, certainly since probably the 14th century, the last 600 or 700 years. And what she did was to find a herb. And she found that if you extracted this particular herb very carefully and got the right chemical from it, artemisinin, you could then, in fact, actually use this eventually as a medicine. And she had to do all sorts of experiments. She put the herb in water, and she got some of the right principle out, the right chemical, but then she thought she'd make it quicker by boiling the water or making it hot, and she found that when she used hot water, it didn't work at all. And it was a long time before she realized that actually heating the solution at all actually killed all the chance of getting this chemical intact and then making a drug. And eventually, in fact, she had to cool the water. The sad thing about her, Tu Youyou, the sad thing about her was that nobody in the Western world, in England or in Europe, believed her because she was Chinese. They thought, well, because she's a Chinese woman, she can't be trusted. What she got, it just doesn't work. This is just another drug. And it was 20 years with people dying from malaria unnecessarily before suddenly we decided to try the drug. And when we did, we found it was incredibly successful. So I think that she is a particularly wonderful person to be a role model. Can I tell you some more? Here is a lovely young man. This is Richard Turere from Kenya. Kenya, of course, is in East Africa. And he did an invention which really was very, very important. He found his family were farmers. His dad was a farmer, had lots of cattle. He was from the Maasai tribe. The Maasai are people who basically keep cattle, they keep cows, and they use their milk. And of course, they use every part of the farming to try and sustain. And if they don't, if they have a bad harvest, for example, or more particularly if their cows die, or if the weather is very bad and there's no water, so there's no plants for the animals to eat, they will all die. But one of the problems in parts of Kenya, of course, is that there are many fierce animals. And one of the fiercest animals, of course, in Kenya, and I've been very close to them when they're quiet, I've seen these lions in the wild. I've stood within a few feet of a lion, actually with its cubs, and one has to be very careful if you do that. You need to have somebody with you who knows what you're doing to protect you. Now, what he found was that at night time, the lions used to come out, get into the field where the cattle were kept, and they started to attack the animals. And the animals, of course, died, and they would eat them. And so, in fact, his father's herd was gradually reduced, and the family were facing complete poverty and even starvation. And then Richard Turere had a brilliant idea. He'd noticed when he'd gone out at night, very bravely actually, with a torch, that if he shone the torch in the direction of the lions, they fled. They didn't like a bright light. So then what he did was he rigged up a whole series of torches along a wire fence, and he dismantled an old radio set, and he devised a little device which switched the torches on intermittently at different times right through the night without anybody being there. And that kept the lions away, and his father had a very healthy herd, and the family have lived ever happily ever after. I think that's a lovely story. So even a young teenager, in his case, can do stuff which is very, very important. Now let me come to somebody who I think is one of the really most interesting and important inventors of all time. It's a very long name. Johannes Gutenberg is somebody we all need to be grateful for. Gutenberg is important because Gutenberg was really the man who really basically pioneered printing in Germany. There's nothing really more important than being able to read and write. And what Gutenberg did was he stopped the need for having manuscripts, i.e. scrolls where very, very limited people could really buy them. And he invented printing, which made, in fact, printed words much, much cheaper to make, much, much cheaper to read or to buy, and books became all important. So really, in the sort of I suppose, the 15th century, in 1450, he, with his invention of printing with the printing press, was able to use a single set of type, printing 100 pages of the same page, which would then go into a book, and he would do this and make very big books. And some of Gutenberg's books are still around. It may not be entirely surprising to you to know that, in fact, the first book ever printed was, in fact, the Bible. And the Gutenberg Bible that he printed is still hugely valuable. Nowadays, of course, Gutenberg's books and books from early printing they're worth millions of pounds because they're historically so interesting. Now, I would love to know how I can answer your questions. I've got people online here. I've got names of lines, but I don't know where the questions are. And I don't know. Hello, what happens here? No, I don't think these questions are for me. In fact, I'm sure they're not. So I am really lost here. Maybe I should ring somebody. I don't know. I can't see how I do this because right, I've got some questions now in this margin here. So somebody says, Haley Cox. Haley asks me, I hope I've got this right, how did I decide which inventions to include in the book? Well, we had a team of people, and we all decided really at DK, Dorling Kindersley, which is the publishers, who we thought were the most interesting. We wanted to really have a mix of people. We wanted to show that inventors aren't necessarily brilliantly famous or very well known, and we wanted to show people who tried very hard to be successful. And I wanted to get a different mix. I wanted very much to have some people who don't really get credit for being inventive, for example, African people. And I wanted to make sure that a lot of Chinese people were there as well. And most importantly, of course, I wanted to encourage women, because you girls are every bit as good as boys at doing inventions. So really, I think that was an important point. Now, Lynn Russell says hello, but she doesn't seem to ask me a question. So I don't know what to say to her. So Kerry Power has asked me which invention story in my book is my favorite. Well, I think if you buy the book, it's on page 117. My memory for numbers is tricky, so it may take me a moment to find it. But yes, so in something like 1600, there was a Chinese man called Wan Hu. And Wan Hu wanted to do something that really perhaps a large number of humans have all wanted to do. Wan Hu wanted to fly to the moon. And in order to fly to the moon, he got this big wooden chair, and he attached 42 rockets to the chair with bits of rope, tied them on tightly, and then he sat on the chair and the rockets were lit. Now, I think that what happened was there was a big puff of smoke and a huge bang, and he disappeared. Basically, I think the explosion threw him in the air, but we don't know what happened to him. He certainly flew, but I doubt if he flew to the moon. So I think that's one of the problems. Which of all of my books for children is my favourite is the next one. Well, I like inventors, but I think the one that's most popular at the moment is one that I wrote with my grandchildren in mind. It's this book. It's Ask a Scientist. And Ask a Scientist basically is about the questions that school children have asked me in primary school. So basically what we did was we collected about 100 of the most popular questions, like why are we here? What lies on the other side of the moon? Why are rainbows the colour they are? And so on. And I put these together as questions, and I tried them out on my grandchildren, who are all between the ages of 3 to 10, and they sort of decided what questions I should ask. And then Dorling Kindersley, the publishers, they put the questions on the web, and they put a whole lot of information on the web about ask a question, and we got questions from all over the world, from South America and from Asia, and we put them all together. We put the best questions together, and then I wrote out what I thought were the answers. And I've tried to make it a bit funny, because actually I don't like taking science too seriously. Science is fun. The thing about science is that you're finding out things, and I'm now very old, but I still am finding out new things. I'm still learning, and as long as you're learning, life is interesting, and you're being useful for other people. So I think part of the trick of Ask a Scientist was I think, doing that. Now, I was sent a sheet of questions. I'm sorry, I don't have them to hand because my computer is occupied at the moment. So I'm using it for this FaceTime, which is why I can't download them. So, what inventions have I created? Says Ethan. Well, I think, let me just go through it really. I suppose as as an adult, my first invention was making very small instruments with which you could join together very, very small blood vessels. So the blood vessels I and my colleagues were joining up were about 0.5 mm in diameter. That is, we're putting stitches around a piece of vessel which is smaller than a fine piece of thread, and you'd think, why would that be important? Well, it's important because actually it tells us a great deal about how you can prevent blood clotting, and it led to improving transplanting organs. So not only did we learn how to transplant organs using the techniques that we were pioneering, but it also led to improving plastic surgery. Sometimes people get terrible burns or shocking wounds to their face, and that ends up with them needing a big transplant of some skin and fat onto their face to improve their appearance and make them look much more human. And my first ever was when I was living in Belgium. A man came in to the hospital, and I was just a researcher. I wasn't really looking at patients then. And I was told that a man had come in. He'd come from a factory, and about an hour earlier, he'd put his hand in a sawmill and he'd cut his hand off at the wrist. He had no hand from his wrist. And over the next 15 hours, I and my colleague Willie Books, we worked together, collaboration, we worked together to sew that hand back on again, to sew the arteries together, to sew the veins together, to start to repair the nerves, replace the skin that had been lost, and put it together and fuse the bones so that he had a workable hand. Now, in Belgium, that was the first time that operation had ever been done. That was in 1976, something like that. It's a long time ago, so before most of you were born. And that, I think, has now become quite commonplace. We were lucky, of course, because the people who found him fainting in the factory and bleeding to death with this terrible injury picked up the hand, quite brave of them really, off the floor, put it in a plastic bag with some ice, and brought it with him to the hospital so that we could actually still have a hand that was usable. So, next question. Do you think we take inventors for granted? I think we certainly take inventors for granted because, of course, if you think about it, everything that we do, if we get on a bus, we're responsible for somebody who invented the internal bus engine. If we go on a plane, then, of course, we've got the Wright brothers to thank us for the first people who flew, and the people, of course, who then made jet engines like Frank Whittle. We think about the television set, and we've got John Logan Baird, who helped us make televisions. We are at the moment communicating, of course, on the internet, and the internet, of course, was designed by Tim Berners-Lee, and he never thought it would be as big as it was. He was just doing it so some colleagues of his some scientists could work together in an area in Switzerland at CERN. He never thought for a moment it would become a World Wide Web. He didn't envisage anything this big, and of course he won the Nobel Prize for that. So I think we take that for granted. We take the electricity we're using for granted. We take the energy that we are using for granted. And of course, one of the things that we have to understand is that all these inventions, wonderful though they are, important though they are, also usually have a downside. For example, using too much energy risks the planet. Burning things which produce carbon dioxide risks the planet. If we're not careful with infection and we don't treat germs properly, we can end up with viruses. And there are so many examples where inventions are essential, of course, to help us, but if we don't use them properly, we can actually have more damage than good. Let's take another one. Is everyone capable of being an inventor? Well, I think everybody is to some extent. Nearly everybody is an inventor. You might do something very simple. You might, for example, have a gadget that's not quite working and you stick a coin in it or put a piece of wood, a stick in it, and you actually become an inventor when you do that. So my top tips for being inventive, actually, I think really, they would be to really keep trying, and see how something works, work out how it works, therefore work out why it's not working, and then actually see if you can improve it. And that really is not a matter of great interest. What invention is my least favourite? Well, gosh, let's have a look in this book and see what might remind me. I suppose I'm not sure I can really give you a serious answer to that. But for example, I suppose Cather Paulus, who who was an aerial performer, performed on a parachute. I don't think I would want to do that. That would be a pretty least favourite thing. And of course, people who first tried it, they died when they hit the ground. Actually, if you hit the ground fast enough, you can do yourself a lot of damage. Now, somebody says, writing non-fiction is different from writing a story. What advice would I give to young people or adults who want to write factual books? I think, actually, in my view, because I write factual books for adults too. I'm writing one at the moment, a memoir. I think the way you do this best is to tell a story. I think you have to think of the story. So these non-fiction books, these stories, these pages of inventors that I've produced, each one of these inventors' book pages is a story about the inventor and a story to some extent about the invention. And the reason why I think stories are very important is because, when we were very primitive early humans, we would sit at the cave mouth at the end of the day by the fire, and we would tell each other stories. We would say, this is what I did today. God Lord, I came very close to killing that antelope, or maybe I was attacked by that lion, but I escaped. So basically, you tell the story, and we're attuned. The human brain wants to hear a story, and we learn facts from stories. Don't think that, of course, fiction is different because fiction uses the imagination in a different kind of way. But actually, non-fiction is also, I believe, telling stories. And I think the best textbooks I've had, certainly the great men who wrote the textbooks from which I learned, they all told stories, things that had happened to them, things that had gone wrong, things where they actually got it wrong, things that went right, things where they were congratulated, things where people thought that they were doing things which were really bad or very good. And I think that's very much part of the very much part of the story. Who's my favourite inventor from history, modern day? Well, I don't know really that I've got a favourite inventor. I think all the time, we learn of new inventions that become really important. I suppose at the moment, the people who are really impressive are the people who are going to solve the problem with the current virus outbreak. All of those require inventions. We need to invent new vaccines. Do you know there are over 400 new vaccines being invented at the moment as we speak? All of these are attempts to try and find a vaccine which will prevent us getting this virus. And I think we will be successful soon enough. I think another example, of course, is another group of people are inventing antiviral drugs. So there's a huge number of people working, inventing new drugs which will kill the virus, which is another way of being hopeful. And then there are other ways that we're looking, some inventors are looking at how we could invent things which will prevent the virus getting into the body, and also ways that we could encourage the immune system to tackle the virus as soon as it sees it. and we think that's possible. And then there are some of us who believe that we could probably get the virus to mutate, that is, to change its DNA or the RNA, the genetic material that it carries, and then we would be able to actually make it unable to recreate itself. It wouldn't be able to replicate, and then, of course, it wouldn't be harmless anymore. It wouldn't be dangerous anymore. And then finally, people are still inventing better tests for the virus. That's a very important thing because, of course, what we want to know is if you're not well, do I have the virus? And at the moment, the tests we are doing are still taking a bit too long. They're getting quicker, but there are ways of trying to make them cheaper, faster, and more effective. So, I think I've talked about the vaccine. Um, if you look into the future, says Jacqueline, is there one invention we don't have now that will change our lives forever? Well, you tell me. Um, don't you think that all sorts of inventions change our lives in all sorts of ways? You think about it. When the virus came out, we never thought for a moment that we would all be learning in the way we are using and communicating in the way we are using this form of communication. Do you know, that is something which is really staggeringly interesting. So now I think we will find that that will change the world forever because, in fact, we will no longer, in fact, be so ready to fly, to travel, when actually we can communicate perfectly well with things like Zoom or other methods of internet, in this case, Facebook. Will human beings emigrate from this planet? Well, Elon Musk, the inventor, certainly thinks so. He's in the book, and I've written about him. Elon Musk, of course, is one of the first private individuals to build a rocket ship, and he's the first person to fly people without a government, without government funding, to fly people to the space station. So, in fact, we have got people leaving the planet, but they are coming back. But eventually, I think many of us believe that it will be probably likely that we will have in time humans living outside the Earth permanently on sort of little islands, if you like, which are protected, have the right environment, the right atmosphere. They would, to my mind, I think it would be terribly prison-like, but maybe some people will like that and they will end up preferring that to living on Earth, particularly if Earth becomes less inhabitable. I don't think that we need worry too much that Earth will become less inhabitable. I think we will be able to deal with that. But certainly the idea of expanding humanity outside the Earth is certainly very intriguing. Now, Lisa, what have you asked? Will it be safe? Oh, I see, yes. So Peter asks, are there aliens out there? And then Lisa, replying to Peter, says, will it be safe? So, Peter, you've asked the question that everybody's asking, but nobody can answer. Who knows whether there are aliens out there? We've never been really sure that there are aliens, but given the size of the universe, given that it takes traveling at the speed of light millions of years to get across the universe, it seems highly probable that somewhere out there will be some separate suns like our own, or maybe different from our own, but producing an atmosphere on individual planets, which will make it possible, in fact, to create some form of life. And that life will be alien because anything which doesn't grow on Earth is effectively alien. So at the moment, there are a number of human scientists who every day are looking for aliens using radio communication, using telescopes. They're mostly in America. That's where they've been mostly sort of excited by this. And they're looking for messages from outer space to see if aliens are there. But so far, they've been looking a very long time, 30, 40 years, certainly 30 years, but nobody has definitely answered the telephone yet. They send out messages, but of course it takes so long for the messages to get there. They would be sending messages which would be millions of years back in time because of the speed of light being so slow relative to how far the space is. So, oh dear, somebody says they were lucky to hear me on this, I'll remove that, I know that person. Which invention has impressed you more than the others? I think I've really dealt with that. What do I think of the anti-vaccine crowd? Well, there are some people who believe that vaccines are bad for you. Well, I must say that's an example of ignorance. Let me just say to you that I think it's very unwise to be proud of being ignorant. Being ignorant is stupid. And of course, if you are simply anti-vaccine for no good reason, then you are ignorant, and I fear you're behaving stupidly, even if you're not stupid. There are some intelligent people who behave stupidly, but not believing in vaccines is important. The problem with the vaccine is this, that we don't need vaccines to be healthy. Most of us will never need a vaccine. But unfortunately, from time to time, we do come into contact with serious, dangerous, possibly fatal microbes which can damage our health, damage our immune system. And the risk, of course, is that we need to deal with that. And it's better to do this before we get ill. So vaccines are designed to prevent people getting ill by killing or by helping our immune system to deal with any pathogens. And there is no question that over the years, vaccines have completely changed how humans live very, very successfully. You know, when before you were born, you young people, plague was still a problem. People, millions of far worse than this virus. People were dying of Black Death. London was devastated. Parts of Europe, half the people died with the Black Death. Not just 1% of the population getting the virus, but actually half people dying of a bacterium causing plague. And as children, of course, the measles vaccine has saved so many lives, and it's also clearly saved a great number of people from very serious brain injury who get measles. I've nursed one of my own children through a measles epidemic when she got a very bad attack of measles, and I believe, you know, it was very, very frightening. And she recovered completely, but you never know, and I think that's something to remember. So let's move on. Where do we go? I think people are now thanking me, so I probably need to ring off. What happens if you take any virus into space? Marcus, age 9, says. Marcus, that's a great question. Maybe that's a good question to finish with. The truth is, we don't really know. We know that viruses will be killed by extreme temperatures, very hot certainly, and probably not by very cold. Whether they would live completely for a long period of time in a vacuum in space is uncertain. I think, though, that actually viruses would not have a great chance of survival outside a spacecraft because the ultraviolet radiation, for one thing, would probably kill them. You know, sunlight is quite effective against viruses. One of the reasons why we don't all pick up the virus when we touch things that other people have touched who've got the virus. I'm not suggesting we should handle things where people have touched it, but actually, if you're in sunlight, the sunlight does a pretty good job of killing viruses. Well, look, you people, it's been lovely talking to you, and I hope that you enjoyed this. And let me just say that, what can I say? I think, you know, anybody can be an inventor. More important, anybody can be a scientist. And actually being a scientist is even more important than being an inventor, because it's the scientists who use the knowledge available and actually start not just to invent, but to work out how things work. And let me tell you that if you persist in science, just remember that science is not difficult, it's rational. You can always work out science from basic principles. And sometimes if you become a scientist, or if you start to read or do or study science, eventually there'll come a time, as I did when I was 16, you'll see something that nobody else has ever seen before in quite that way, perhaps down a microscope or in a telescope or on an X-ray machine, whatever it is. That is a very, very exciting moment. And that's happened to me several times in my life. And there have been times when I've danced, when I've celebrated, and I've realized this is absolutely magnificent. You see the world with all its beauty in a way that nobody has seen it before. So very good luck to you. And I hope that you have a good time with your lessons and learning a bit more about science. Thank you for listening to me.